Jacob had to flee from his uncle to return back to his birthplace in Canaan. Jacob and his large family had to pass through the territory of Esau, his twin brother, to whom Jacob had defrauded of his birthright and blessing of the firstborn. After receiving news of Esau coming with a band of 400 men, after sending his family and all his servants ahead, Jacob probably had time to reflect on himself, but not for long. We read, then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Genesis 32:24. Here's a brief run-through of the event. The person was none other than the pre-incarnate Christ, the appearance of Christ in the Old Testament prior to his incarnation as Son of Man in the New Testament. That wrestling match lasted for hours till dawn, and seeing that Jacob refused to submit, the man touched the socket of his hip joint to dislocate it. Genesis 32:25. Jacob stubbornly held on to the man and said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked for Jacob's name, verse 27. After receiving the name, then came the name change. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but instead Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Verse 28. That event ended with a blessing from the man, and he blessed him there. Verse 29. Firstly, from the broader perspective of the Abrahamic Covenant, to Abraham, God said, get out of your own country to a land that I will show you. The land. I will make you a great nation, the people, and you shall be a blessing. The blessing. That is the Abrahamic Covenant, a promise from God concerning a new people, Israel, coming from Abraham, possessing the land of Canaan and receiving a blessing to be a blessing to the whole world. But God had to deal with the third generation recipient, Jacob, the supplanter and schemer. Isn't that true of us? If we need God's blessing, do we allow him to deal with us first? Secondly, Jacob struggled with the man and did not want to submit. That struggle shows us how at times we hang on to our own willful ways and we refuse to give in to God's control. God has to overpower us in the way he did to Jacob. Have we ever struggled with God, refusing to give up our willful way and sin? I'm sure we have. Thirdly, the dislocation of Jacob's hip joint was not so much as to show who finally won the wrestling match. It is a picture of how at times God has to dislocate our plan that goes against his will. God may use failures and disappointments in life to put our well-crafted plan out of joint. Will we be tempted to blame God for dislocating our plan? Fourthly, Jacob wrestling with God led to Jacob clinging on to God. Let me go, the man said, but Jacob, being made helpless by the dislocated hip joint, held on to the man. It is a picture of a person finally surrendering to the will of God. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Verse 26. Does this teach us about clinging on to God? Yes, indeed. Let us spend that precious moment in intimacy with God. Lord, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Lastly, the high point of that spiritual encounter was when God said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. Verse 28. From supplanter to prince with God. That's what Israel means. Name changes often signify a new relationship with God. From Israel would arise a new people, the children of Israel, that will inherit the promised land of Canaan. And through Israel would arise the Savior of the world. Jacob, with the name Israel, finally received what he wanted so much, and he blessed him there. Verse 29. The covenant blessing. Jacob prevailed with God because he was in weakness, the dislocation of his hip joint, that he prevailed. So if we regard intense prayer or fasting as wrestling with God, be aware that it is not twisting God's arm to make him do what we want him to do. Rather, it is being willing to have our hip joint dislocated. That is, it is in brokenness and failure and the realization of our disobedience, our dislocated life, that we cling on to God to receive his blessing.